Our next speaker is one of my favorite authors. He was one of the first people I thought of when we were finding speakers for this event. His books are for sale out in the foyer, and he's graciously agreed to do a book signing for anybody who has any of his books. He has won a Hugo Award, which is the science fiction equivalent. No?
Hugo.
Oh, sorry. 2 Nebula Awards. Nebula Awards are voted on by science fiction and fantasy authors for their peers. It's like the Oscars for writers. So, please welcome James Morrow.
Thank you, Christine. Well, because time is at a premium, we will not have a moment of silence and acknowledgement of the death of God. In fact, I'm gonna read my notes and save improvisation for the Q&A. Why Darwin's theory really is bad news for theism. One of the advantages of being a novelist is that you can feign expertise in fields that you, in fact, know very little about. Although I'm neither a trained theologian nor a credentialed biologist, this afternoon I'm going to hold forth on matters both theological and biological. But please bear with me, I believe I have something to contribute to what I call the great post-enlightenment conversation. I have a pretty terrific job. For most of my adult life, I've been paid to conduct philosophical thought experiments in the form of novels. Some of them published as historical fiction, some as science fiction, some as fantasy, some as uncategorizable. Uncategorizable is not a great career move by me. And so we have Towing Jehovah. A thought experiment asking, thank you, Christine. A thought experiment asking, what if a disgraced supertanker captain was assigned by the archangel Raphael to tow the 2-mile-long corpse of God to its final resting place in an Arctic tube? We have blameless, abandoned, but of a small town, small time magistrate put God on trial for crimes against humanity. The last Witchfinder, what if a brilliant young woman born on the cusp of the Enlightenment undertook to bring down single-handedly the parliamentary witchcraft statute of 1604 by pretending to be a witch herself? And while I didn't come here to flog my books, oh, who am I kidding? I did come here to flog my books, but I also came to share with you the results of my latest literary thought experiment. It's a novel about the coming of the Darwinian worldview. It's called Galápagos Regained, and it will appear early next year from St. Martin's Press. It includes a blurb from Rebecca Goldstein, who we heard about in Andy Norman's marvelous talk this morning. Now, I must disclose at the outset that I prepared this talk in a state of extreme ambivalence, anxiety even, because my conclusions put me at odds with some thinkers I greatly admire, who I normally would count as allies in the group fight against irrationality. I'm speaking, for example, of the admirable analytic philosopher Thomas Nagel, who was actually the mentor of Rebecca Goldstein at NYU. Thomas Nagel, whose most recent book, a short treatise called Mind and Cosmos, is subtitled, fasten your seatbelts, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. I'm speaking of the late Stephen Jay Gould, who spent so much of his career elucidating biological marvels for lay people such as myself. But sad to say, it was also Stephen Jay Gould who exhorted us Darwin aficionados to remain silent on theological matters. Well, just so long as priests and ministers and rabbis refrain from pronouncing on scientific questions. Jerry Coyne spoke to this problem yesterday in his talk. As most of you know, I'm alluding to NOMA, N-O-M-A. Stephen Jay Gould's notion of non-overlapping magisterium, which he lays out in his book, Rocks of Ages. Now, the problem, of course, is that the NOMA paradigm simply doesn't work. If we are honest children of the Enlightenment, we cannot see questions of meaning and metaphysics and ethics to the alleged expertise of clerics. The world's religious organizations have made a complete botch of meaning and metaphysics and ethics, and I wish that Professor Gould had not pretended otherwise. I'm even speaking of the estimable Michael Shermer, founder of the International Skeptics Society, a man who has worked tirelessly to rein in the excesses of New Age folderol. But alas, it was also Michael Shermer who, in his book, Why Darwin Matters, and after hearing Andy Norman this morning, I thought maybe that book should be called Why Your Rational Intellect Matters. But Shermer argued that Christian conservatives ought to regard evolutionary principles as, quote, God's way of creating life. Maybe God is the laws of nature or even nature itself. And elsewhere in the book, Shermer invites Christian conservatives to ask themselves, quote, what difference does it make how God created life via spoken word or via natural forces? That's not a very good question, in my opinion. Both theists and skeptics would be well within their rights to reply, it makes all the difference in the world. If God created life through natural forces, then he must be some sort of cosmic fiend. The heroine of Galápagos Regained is Chloe Bathurst, an unemployed Victorian actress who in 1848 gets a job as governess on Charles Darwin's estate, Down House. This is more than a decade before Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species. Chloe soon learns that she will be minding Mr. Darwin, not Mr. Darwin's children, but rather the live specimens he brought back from his journey to the Galápagos archipelago. Giant tortoises, all manner of finches and iguanas, both terrestrial and aquatic. Now, as it happens, the historical Darwin maintained no such menagerie at Down House, but the fine print on my poetic license allows me to give him one. In the course of performing her zookeeping duties, my heroine becomes privy to conversations between Darwin and his scientific colleagues, the geologist Charles Lyell, the ornithologist John Gould, the botanist Joseph Hooker. Chloe learns not only of Darwin's concept of unsupervised transmutation, but also of something called the Great God Contest, a competition being sponsored at Oxford University by the Percy Bysshe Shelley Society. This organization of atheists and rakels is prepared to award a huge cash prize of £10,000 to the first scientist or philosopher or theologian who can prove or disprove the existence of God. The results of the contest will be decided by a 6-person panel of judges, half of them freethinkers, half of them members of the Anglican community. My heroine resolves to enter the Great God Contest. She needs the money to pay off her father's debts. And she knows that according to Mr. Darwin, at least, the theory of natural selection might be construed as an argument against God's presumed reality. So Chloe approaches Mr. Darwin with a proposal. She wants to borrow his illustrative specimens, the birds and the reptiles, transport them to Oxford, display them before the judges, and split the prize money with her employer. Now, Darwin, as you might imagine, is horrified by Chloe's scheme. It completely scandalizes him. And so she sees no choice but to recapitulate Darwin's famous voyage to the Galápagos Islands, her aim being to round up her own menagerie of telltale reptiles and birds. After a year's worth of adventures in South American jungles, Chloe and her traveling companions reach Galápagos as planned, but as luck would have it, one of the islands has been colonized by some Mormon settlers. Warren Egwart and his 7 wives. Now, for reasons too complicated to explain right now, this novel is rather top-heavy with plot. For reasons too complicated to explain, Orrin Egwart ends up putting 2 of Chloe's shipmates, a sailor and a prostitute, on trial for blasphemy. And the only defense that Orrin Egwart, the Mormon, will allow is for Chloe to convince the 12 jurymen that God doesn't exist. If her friends lose their case, they will be hanged in a public execution. Blasphemy is a capital crime on Egwart's private island. So my heroine parades various Galápagos specimens through the courtroom. Well, it's actually a tabernacle. So much the better. 3 varieties of giant tortoise, 4 species of mockingbird, 4 species of marine iguana, 2 species of terrestrial iguana, all the while explicating her former employer's theory of descent with modification. Chloe ultimately offers the jurors 3 reasons why transmutationism is tantamount to a proof, to a disproof of God. The first reason is so obvious, it's almost embarrassing to put it into words. If the scriptural account of creation is entirely fallacious, then perhaps the creator who's doing all that creating is non-existent. In a weird way, I have more respect for biblical literalists than I do who regard Darwin as the Antichrist. More respect for biblical literalists than I do for public intellectuals who glibly declare that theism and evolution are wholly compatible. The literalists at least take the problem seriously. So what about those thinkers who allow for a God who somehow suffuses the machinery of biological evolution? Well, I think it behooves them to ask, what kind of God are we talking about? The best answer I've ever encountered to that question appeared in a 2001 essay by the literary critic Frederick C. Cruz. Cruz argues that if a person-like supernatural entity undergirds the laws of nature, then this deity is evidently, quote, a curiously inept cobbler of species that need to be periodically revised and that keep getting snuffed out by the very conditions he provided for. I love that. They keep getting periodically snuffed out by the very conditions he, God, provided for them. Why, we must wonder, would the shaper of the universe have frittered away 13 billion years, turning out quadrillions of useless stars before getting around to the one thing he really cared about, seeing to it that a minuscule minority of earthling vertebrates are washed clean of sin and guaranteed an eternal place in his company. Unquote. My heroine offers a second reason for regarding transmutation as incompatible with religious belief, or at least with Christian religious belief. In this part of her testimony, my heroine targets lapsarian theology, fallen man and all that, the divine agenda, whereby, to use Frederick Cruz's terminology, a minuscule minority of earthly vertebrates must be washed clean of sin. Public intellectuals who are keen on religion tend to reason as follows, in my observation. Hey, all you atheists out there, hey, all you secular humanists, lighten up. The Garden of Eden narrative is manifestly a myth, and everybody knows that except for a bunch of hillbillies. We don't have to choose between the talking snake of Genesis and the dinosaurs of paleontology. Unbelievers, get over yourselves. But surely it's worth remembering that for centuries, Christian theology turned on the absolute factuality of the Eden narrative. The vast majority of all the Christian thinkers who've ever lived would tell you that Adam's misadventure with the apples was an historical event as real as Alexander's campaigns or Julius Caesar's assassination. That's certainly how the church fathers, Augustine, Tertullian, Polycarp, and the rest, that's certainly how they understood the Christian narrative. That's certainly how Thomas Aquinas, the other medieval scholastics, interpreted the coming of Christ. That's certainly how the 19th century Christian philosophers framed their faith. If you read the renowned Christian existentialist, Søren Kierkegaard, his book, The Concept of Dread, for example, you'll find arguments key to the presumed literal fact of Adam's disobedience, not to some nebulous metaphorical notion of original sin. But then Darwin comes along, and he says, hey, Kierkegaard, but you see, I always love the image in one of Adam Cotton's essays, is Darwin was a kind of latter-day Columbo. But you see, Mr. Kierkegaard, there was no Adam. Well, if there was no Adam, then there was no lapse from grace, and if there was no lapse from grace, there was no need for a divine rabbi, Jesus Christ, the second Adam, to arrive among us and redeem that non-existent first man's primordial sin. To return to my earlier motif, I almost have more respect for biblical literalists who find Darwin theologically indigestible than I do for church-going philosophers who blithely ignore 1,500 years of rigorous and systematic Christian intellectual thought. To put all this another way, Augustine, Aquinas, Kierkegaard, and the rest were fundamentalists. It simply won't do to dismiss fundamentalism as the province of chuckleheads and snake handlers. Today's fundamentalists were yesterday's respected theological thinkers. My heroine makes a third and final argument in her efforts to keep her friends off the scaffold. Chloe invites the 12 jurymen to imagine a global human community in which the scientific worldview came first and a supernaturalist interpretation of the universe emerged much later. In fact, such a materialist/atomistic worldview did flourish for a time in the ancient world, alluding to the philosophy of the Greek sage, Epicurus, as some of you anticipated, I'm sure. Epicureanism, as many of you know, inspired a long anti-religious poem written around 54 BC by the Roman philosopher Lucretius. According to this poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, or on the nature of the universe. According to Lucretius' poem, even the gods are made of atoms, though that hardly matters, since these deities are wholly different to human affairs. So let's reverse, as Chloe does, let's reverse the temporal poles of Western civilization and imagine that the proto-scientific vision of Lucretius triumphed and supernaturalism never got up to speed. As I put it in my novel, suppose the Roman church lost and the Roman poet won. Here's an excerpt from the climactic trial scene in Galápagos Regained, the moment when Chloe, standing in the Mormon tabernacle before the jury on Charles Island, bids the 12 to engage in a theological thought experiment key to Epicureanism. Now imagine, Chloe said, now imagine that after our hypothetical atomist civilization has been thriving for several thousand years, a bearded patriarch comes traipsing out of the desert. Hearken, he cries, an invisible but very talkative and person-like entity has manifested himself to me. Hearken, this entity is the very architect of the cosmos, dwelling everywhere and causing everything. You must outgrow your childish affection for the given world and fall down in awe before the one true God. Slipping free of the witness chair, Chloe marched towards the jury, where she favored each man with the same beguiling smile she cultivated whilst playing Queen Cleopatra. She was out-of-work actress. Very well, says Chloe. I suppose it's conceivable that our atomists would leap for joy, turn to the patriarch and say, my goodness, sir, you certainly got that right. Your one true God theory harmonizes perfectly with our materialist understanding of the world. Your revelation accords completely with our reason. Thank you for bringing us this marvelous gift. Miss Bathurst, sit down, cried Edward. He also appointed himself chief magistrate. Sit down. You're attempting to mesmerize the jury. Conceivable, good sirs, said Chloe, but implausible. So implausible, in fact, that I shall abstain from elaboration, lest I insult the shade of Epicurus by taking his foes seriously. So, does Chloe rescue her friends from the hangman? We'll just have to read them. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
No questions? Where's the guy with the baseball hat?
How you doing? That sounds like an interesting story.
Thank you.
Really, I think what I have to say, it doesn't have to really do with the book. What it has to do with something in the book. The story you told about, well, if Adam and Eve did not exist and evolution actually is true, then the original sin didn't exist, therefore we didn't need to be redeemed from original sin. So no need for Jesus.
Yeah.
Have you heard any religious argument for that?
I know of evangelicals who reject Darwinism on precisely those grounds. That's why it makes them nervous.
But how about the people like
and that's why I weirdly respect their logic.
Like say the Catholics, they agree with evolution.
What's that?
The Catholics agree with evolution.
Do what?
Yeah.
The Catholics.
That's an excellent question.
Right. Do they have any good counter argument for that is what I'm asking. Because, I mean, obviously Jesus is not necessary if Adam and Eve didn't exist.
Well, it's all, the church is so brilliant at just kind of patching things up. Like the whole appears, and then you say, only kidding, or it was only metaphorical. It was a fall only in a symbolic sense. And at some point, original sin got inserted into one of our ancestral hominid cousins. Does the church believe in evolution? They condescendingly said, I guess I forget who it was, well, it's more than a theory. But then they immediately said, however, there must be the supernatural insertion of a soul at some point in human evolution, which is their real agenda.
All right, thank you.
The evolutionary mystic, Teilhard de Chardin, who gave us that wonderfully baroque notion of the omega point, this teleological cosmology. The Vatican gave him hell for being a paleontologist.
Are there any more questions? James? Well, I was going to say that. I'll be a fangirl for a minute. I love going to the bat because the hero, you said, tries with the church for the crimes against humanity, and I was with him every step of the way. Yes. That's been a dream of mine, but then I'd have to go to law school. So I just love that book, and I highly encourage you to read it. It's very, very good.